Welcome to Chapter 5 of our Civil War unit, Growing Apart. The Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution began in Great Britain around the year 1760, but did not reach its full height until the 1840s. Before the Industrial Revolution, most goods were made by hand and in the household. By the late 1700s, the production of goods was drastically changed. Machines were created, such as the power loom, that could produce goods at a much faster rate than any one person could, and in much larger quantities. One invention, James Watt's steam engine, helped to power many of the machines that were created, including later the locomotive. Textiles, goods made of cloth, especially cotton, were the primary good produced during this time. It marked the beginning of capitalism and manufacturing, which meant making something on a large scale using machinery. Birth of the factory system. Factories were created to help produce textiles and other goods on a very large scale. These buildings were filled with large machines used for making goods easily and cheaply. Originally, they were powered through the use of water wheels and were often located near major rivers or streams. Later, these machines were powered by steam engines. While nicer goods were initially made by skilled workers, the factory system made it possible for anyone to make goods as long as they could complete a small task or work a simple machine. Thanks to the factory system, living standards improved and the economy grew exponentially. Samuel Slater. Because of the success of British manufacturers, the British government went out of its way to keep the factories and machines secret, fearing that other countries would steal their ideas. American manufacturers offered rewards for any information on the factories. In 1789, Samuel Slater traveled to America in secret, having memorized every part of the textile machinery. In 1791, Slater opened his first textile mill in Rhode Island. This marked the beginning of the Industrial Revolution in America. Later, Boston merchant Francis Lowell improved upon Slater's design, creating the first factory that wove and dyed cloth. Big cities getting bigger. Hundreds of factories were built throughout New England, making cloth, shoes, pots, pans, guns, etc. This brought great wealth to the northern states, leading to the building of canals and railroads. European immigrants began flocking to the United States in search of work in the factories, and ultimately wealth. While Philadelphia and New York were the only major cities in the North in the 1700s, by 1850 over 100 places in the U.S. were considered cities. New York had 500,000 people, and Philadelphia, St. Louis, Chicago, and others were close behind. To put that into perspective, the Dallas-Fort Worth area has about 7 million people, and Houston has 10 million people. The dangers of factories. While the factory system helped improve the quality of life for many, there were still dangers, especially early on. Machines were very large and dangerous, with workers often losing fingers or even limbs trying to fix them. Work hours were often long, with few breaks in between. Factories were very hot and lacked adequate ventilation, leading to heat stroke or lung problems. Since they were smaller, children were often hired to crawl into machines in order to clear out jams, sometimes not making it out before the machines were started back up. The rural South. While the North was urbanizing at an alarming rate, the South remained true to Thomas Jefferson's dream of a country founded on farming. While large plantations dominated the South's economy, they only constituted a small portion of its population. Most Southerners lived on small farms in small rural towns. Slavery was one of the most important aspects of the Southern economy, in contrast with the factory workers of the North. Unlike the North, there were few major cities in the South, and even fewer railroads or canals. Little changed in the South throughout the 1800s, while the North continued to grow and innovate. Large plantations. While plantations were owned by only a select number of people in the South, they were its primary source of wealth. Plantations were large estates, at least 100 times larger than northern farms, that covered hundreds of acres. Plantation owners often lived in mansions and owned 50 or more slaves. They formed a wealthy class of their own, like the nobility of England or France. Thanks to the Industrial Revolution and the increase in textile production, demand for cotton was at an all-time high. In turn, this increased the demand for slave labor. Small farms. While the South was primarily characterized by large plantations, a majority of Southerners lived on small farms. Few farmers owned slaves, and those that did worked side by side with them on the land. They were often only able to produce enough to provide for themselves. The farms were usually only a few acres, and the soil was not the best. Some dreamed of becoming rich and powerful like the plantation owners, but few, if any, ever made it that far. Because of the influence of the plantation owners, small farmers had little say in the politics of the South. The South's opinion of factories. This is an excerpt from William Grayson, a Southern congressman's poem, The Hireling and the Slave. The hireling. Free but in name, the slaves of endless toil, in squalid hut a kennel for the poor, or noisome cellar stretched upon the floor, his clothing rags, a filthy straw his bed, with offal from the gutter daily fed. These are the miseries, such the wants, the cares, the bliss that freedom for the serf prepares. The slave. Taught by the master's efforts, by his care fed, clothed protected by many a patient ear, from trivial numbers now to millions grown, with all the white man's useful arts their own, industrious, docile, skilled in wood and field, to guide the plow, the sturdy axe to wield. Guarded from want, from beggary secure, he never feels what hireling crowds endure, nor knows like them, in hopeless want to crave, for wife and child the comforts of the slave, or the sad thought that, when about to die, he leaves them to the cold world's charity. In this, Grayson argues that slaves are much better off than factory workers because they have been blessed by these very, very nice masters who have given everything they need and pulled them from essentially what he would consider savagery into civilization, whereas the poor factory workers are left to starve if they can't work and have worse conditions than the slave. As you can see, while the conditions weren't great for factory workers, it was much, much, much worse for slaves, and you can see his bias in this poem. And as you even can point out, as he talks about all the white man's useful arts their own now, he's like, look at how nice white people have been to African Americans by, keeping them as slaves and actually teaching them to be civilized. So you can see also his racism in this as well. Okay. Summary. The Industrial Revolution increased the production and wealth of the North as factories produced goods and provided jobs. The South stuck to farming, and even though they became rich from cotton, there were no major innovations or changes to their culture. Make sure you have the summary copied down in your notes. If you missed any of the terms, they will be included in the subsequent slides.